Our topic today is basically public good, public goods. Okay, so before going into what public good, we have spent time in the first class when we started externality. We talked a lot about rivalry exclusion. Today also we'll talk about that. We'll talk about a lot of things and we'll try to have a game theoretic explanation of the problem that we're going to discuss. The solution of public good is what you have is one of methods, but to understand what the problem actually is more important. Okay, by that you will understand why such a method is basically needed. At the outset, the problem is very simple. The problem is this: public good basically creates a positive externality. Okay, so in the last class we treated negative externality in consumption, in production, and in public good we will actually treat positive externality. That's what the work actually is, but it has other layers also. Okay, so let's start with some definitions. First of all is rival. So a good is rival if any person, if not any, sorry, if only one person can consume it. Okay. A good is rival if only one person can consume it. As for example, examples are very simple. So eating an orange. Okay. Then comes exclusion. What is exclusion? Where others can be prevented from consuming it. Or consume the good. Consuming the good when consumption by several at the same time is possible. Okay, so these two are actually different. Sometimes people get confused in it. So first I am saying only one person can consume it. That basically means that I am preventing the other to do that. But that here this prevention is an impossibility by design. So orange, for example, the reason the other person cannot have it is is defined by the nature of the good. But exclusion is something else. Exclusion is that by design actually consumption by several is possible, but that is being prevented, okay, by some mechanism. So that is the difference. So here also I can write eating an orange. Now how do I exclude others? So exclusion is by price. Okay, exclusion is by price. All right. So what is the lack of rivalry? Just the opposite. So lack of rivalry is everyone can consume. So this can is looking at a possibility. Okay. This something that we have written here also. So consumption by several, that is actually possible. For example, I have given these two examples earlier also. So one is clean air and other is defense. Okay. Now, why are we discussing this? The reason of discussing this is it generates a market failure. Whenever there is a lack of rivalry, there is a market failure that is being generated. That's why we are interested in it. And it is the specific reason why we are not interested in orange right now. Okay. So what is the problem when you have lack of rivalry? The problem associated is that if Okay, if positive price is charged, there will be a market failure. Why? What is the reason? Well, the reason is that the marginal cost, so MC, the marginal cost of providing the good to one person, more than one person, or not more than one, let's write it like this, to to one person more. That is a better writing, right? So MC of providing the good to one person more is 0. So the problem is, if there is a positive price, I must charge that to the first individual, but not the others. What is lack of exclusion? This is something that we have studied in details earlier. So what is it? Lack of exclusion is basically lack of exclusive, or as we said, properly defined property right. Property rights. Now this idea that this will actually create problem, it's not something that is very natural. Okay? If you look at the human history, the natural history will tell you the opposite thing. This is something that we have devised. Whether it has or has not is purely a separate topic. Okay, so for that I'll ask you to look at people who then call themselves physiocrats. Look at them. They are the pioneer of this property rights. Anyways, so what is the problem here? Obviously, the problem here is pretty different from this one. The problem is over exploitation. The problem is over exploitation. And what is the example? For here, let's write example is clean air. Okay. And what is the reason of over exploitation? Why? Because people do not have to pay a price. Obviously, if you have lack of exclusion, that by design says that you don't have to pay a price, and that leads to over exploitation or crowding. Since it is given free, a lot of people will come. Right? That happens all the time. Now, if these problems are severe, obviously the government can actually play a very important role, and government does play a role. Okay, one of the major role of the government is to resolve this problem, and we'll see that while some of the problems are solvable by the action of government, some of the problems are not. Okay, and they are not really being solved in a way which we may call efficient, in the sense that the deadweight loss is 0. Okay, so what is the example here of government's role? So for government's role, the example is very simple: paying the bills of street light. Paying the bills of street light. That's what government does. Now you may argue the fact that government never actually pays the bill. We pay the taxes and government in return pays the bill, and that is perfectly all right. The point is that without government, if it was given to us as a society, we would have seen a result where most streets were dark. Okay, I don't know whether you have seen this this term, which is called private road. Private road is not just a place; it's an actual concept. One of the country which has a lot of private roads is definitely United States. USA. There they have private roads made by a group of people. Why? To drive their limousine. So that other smaller cars they don't enter this road and create disturbance. Now that kind of concept is really rare in this country. But anyways, so this is the reason that the government pays the bills of street light, and this is how such problems can be solved by government. Now, given there is rivalry and exclusion, the two components, and the lack of them, we are essentially looking at four possibilities. And I'm going to write a table containing those four possibilities. And in those possibilities, we will also look into some more examples, and we will get two new terms that will need definition. Okay, so four possibilities. This is either type 1 error, type 2 error, type 2 error, table error. Exclusion, no exclusion. Then here rival or rivalry. So rivalry and no rivalry. Okay. All right. So one which has both of them is called a private good. The kind of goods, assuming which we actually studied micro before the topic of externality. So private good, much like apple, and I'm talking about the fruit, then pencil, etc. Okay. Now something which has rivalry but no exclusion, that is called common property resources. I have mentioned this term earlier also. Common property resources. In short, CPR. The biggest example of this is basically tribal life. You look at tribal life, that's what that is all about. Okay, so here we'll take examples like fishery, which has to be open access. So if you have a restricted fishery, then it will not serve your example. Okay, so fishery, then park, not something like Nico Park, but something which has open access. Okay, so no rivalry and exclusion. Example, club good. That also we have discussed earlier. So something like a concert. Then the biggest current example is Netflix, etc. Okay, and something which satisfied none of them, that is called public good. So defense, clean air, lighthouse, etc. Right? Okay, so here we have four kind of names. So private good, what is it? It is a good which has rivalry and exclusion. Then CPR, which has rivalry but lacks exclusion. Then club good, which has exclusion but not rivalry. and public good. It is neither rivalrous nor exclusive. Okay, so our objective is to reach this and then study how to provide it. Okay, so from this table we have got two more definitions, two more terms. So number one is the CPR. And now we are going to take an example of CPR, which is fishery with open access. And we're going to discuss how big a problem this is, because this is indeed a huge problem. It is a huge problem, and because of this problem, you don't have huge size hilsa. The reason of not having huge hilsa fish is because of this CPR. This creates the problem here. Okay? Okay. Now, first of all, there is one thing to understand. The fishery comes with no exclusion. An open access fishery, it does not come with any exclusion. Then where is the problem here? Why it is overexploited? Because the fish is a private good. The fish is a private good, and that creates the problem. Once the fish is caught, that possesses both rivalry and exclusion. And because of that, what happens is this: if somebody is entering a fishery, an open access fishery, then the reason of catching more and catching quick, okay, a behavior which ultimately leads to overexploitation, that occurs because of what you are catching. The fish itself, it comes with rivalry and exclusion. So if you get more hilsa, for example, from Diamond Harbour or the Bay of Bengal, then you are talking about something that cannot be, something that cannot be caught by others, and you can sell it and you can get money, or even you can eat, but that's too much. Anyways, so fishery, no exclusion, but fish, yes. Fish is a private good. Now that is the problem. Okay. So because of this, over-exploitation happens. Now that is clear to us. But what is this nature of this over-exploitation? Over-exploitation. What is the nature of it? The nature of it is that this exploitation is defined actually by cost imposed on future generation. And when it comes to things like hilsa fish or fresh vegetables, basically you are the future generation. Okay. So the older generation, they actually enjoyed something when that over exploitation was actually happening. Now you are bearing the cost. Okay, and obviously the generation will come after you. They will also bear the cost. But obviously several bodies are trying to reduce the cost, and it's a tough task, and it's a very important task, because if such things continue to occur, then earning a lot of money will actually not help anybody, and that's the scenario that we are facing right now. A lot of money is not bringing quality. Anyways, so what really happens? This is what happens actually. So when you catch a lot of fish, when the catch increases, what happens is that fish available next year reduces. And because fish available next year reduces, it actually leads to more increased catching next year, because fish is reduced. So the rivalry of having the fish, it is intense now. And what does happen because of that? Because of that, the circle continues, reduces further, and so on. So that's how the scenario proceeds. And that's how it is proceeding actually right now. That's how it has been for the last 30 years. Okay. The same thing happens when you are looking at so-called fresh vegetables because of the use of pesticide. These seeds and these pesticides, they guarantee a higher yield, but that higher yield, okay, that basically destroys, which is a CPR, which is land, and then when it destroys the land, next year the use increases, and then again it decreases the power of the land, and so on. Okay, so the basic at the basics of life, that's what is happening right now for a long time. All right. But here we are interested then in the social cost. So this cycle, it helps us to get the fact that if you are looking at the cost of fishing, then in an open access fishery, something like an ocean or sea, or even in some cases river, then actually it is important that we calculate the social cost and not the private cost. So what is the social cost? The private cost of catching it. I mean, when you don't know, there are some fishes which were available when I was in my childhood, and now they're just gone. You can't get them. They're just not available. And obviously the taste, it has changed a lot. Okay, so something that you find tasty is something that I may not find tasty at all. Anyways, but that's practice. That's how you do it. You think if you're paying money, you're getting good things. That's so rare when it comes to all of this. Anyways, so private cost of catching it plus catching it today. Yes, that's important. So catching it today plus externality cost. So this is obviously we are looking at externality. So externality cost from reduced current and future population of fish. Okay, and so we are looking at a negative externality. Okay, so there is also a famous example, and the famous example is extracting petroleum, or for that matter natural gas, from a common pool. From a common pool. That also creates the same problem. Okay. And for petroleum, the largest pool is this earth. Anyways, so dividing it in the countries didn't really solve the problem. Look into the politics behind politics that is going on inside OPEC and other countries. Okay, you will understand that this problem is much difficult than that. Okay, so all of this, they are basically treated under something called resource economics, or there is another branch, energy economics. And obviously these problems are far more practical and important to us than how a corporate company is going to earn more money next year. But anyways, okay, so what are the solutions? Now, till now, what you've studied, from that you know that the solutions are basically of three types. Right? From our past knowledge that we have gathered, we know that there are three kinds of solutions that can help. Number one is restrict access. So that's something that you can do That's something that is done by government. So, for example, one of the biggest example is that government doesn't allow people going into forests in more than a specific number. Government doesn't allow people in forests during monsoon. Okay, because obviously, if you what generally happens is you go there and you then shout, and then that creates a lot of problem to others. Okay, and that's quite a common sight if you go to forests. Anyways, and the number two is that tax. We started the Pigouvian one, and the third one is basically applying the Coase theorem. So you define property right. You define property right and you get done with it. Anyways, now one thing that I must say here, that there are two special cases. In some case, special cases. Number one is a problem called congestion. Congestion, and it is known to you because you live in quite a crowded country. So congestion is basically partial rivalry. Right? It's like trying all the time to keep the safe distance from your fellow passenger in a bus or train. So that's partial rivalry. That's not entirely rivalry, but obviously there is some rivalry. Okay, and number two is the two things that we're going to study, and one of them we just studied, that is club goods that we're going to study, and CPR. They are called impure public goods because they have they satisfy one criteria, but they do not satisfy the other just because of that. They're sometimes called impure public good, and the public good that we have written, which lacks both rivalry and exclusion, that is called pure public good. Okay, that's just terminologies that we use sometimes. Okay, so now we'll go to club good, something that I've talked about earlier also. Okay. So club goods, what is it? Non-rival, but subject to exclusion. That's what it is. Okay. Here we have seen that the MC of providing, I'll write it again, so MC of providing the service to an additional individual is 0. Then what must be the price? In a club good, that's a problem, right? So for example, your Netflix, and that's why the intent of getting it, not paying is so. It's not just because of the high price, but it is also true that what must be the price? Because it is natural that given that the MC is 0, the price should have been 0, but that's not really feasible. So then pricing such a product is quite difficult. So for example, if in the television someone is watching the serials of Zibangla, or if you're watching Netflix, or if you're watching Amazon Prime or anything else, the pricing, it has its problem, because to the company the MC is 0, but if the pricing is done following this, then all the companies will be bankrupt. But then again, when you are charging a price, it may actually go over the willingness to pay of somebody. Okay, and how will you sense that? That is the basic problem. Okay, so we'll look at an example of that. Now, given MC equal to 0 and you cannot really charge that, the scope or the possibility of deadweight loss that is here is huge. This is something that we are actually concerned about, the deadweight loss that it generates. So for example, let's say that price of a movie ticket is 500 rupees per person. Okay, but there are individuals with willingness to pay rupees 300 per person. Okay. Now, given this is true, failing to admit them creates deadweight loss. Correct? So if you keep a high price and your hall goes empty, then what is the point? Because admitting one extra doesn't cost you. If one guy comes and you play the movie in the theater, that's enough, right? Okay, so but if you miss that, then you are creating deadweight loss. So empty hall actually creates a lot of deadweight loss. But as you have seen in reality, that solving this problem with government intervention is quite difficult. So solving this problem with government intervention is quite difficult. And even when the price equals AC, so AC pricing as we have learned it in monopoly, even when P equal to AC, deadweight loss is not zero. Okay, so the deadweight loss is not zero. So I've looked at two new goods, club good and CPR, something we have discussed earlier, but now we discussed them in detail and saw why there is a market failure and how in some cases government intervention can actually help, but in some cases it can miss by a large margin. Now, our original intention, as I said, is to look at public goods, and public goods comes with both of these problems. So public good is both non-rival and non-exclusive. So in the next session, we will discuss in detail, using a bit of game theory, the problem that is posed, how a problem is posed by public goods, and how the general solution that generally, this kind of solution that generally appears in our mind, okay, they do not actually work.